Throw her out before breakfast, the Alpha King told his butler. By breakfast, he'd proposed her grandmother used to say, "A wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin." Maren Voss had heard it every morning of her childhood, standing barefoot on the porch of their small stone cottage at the edge of the Ashvin territory, watching the forest breathe. She had been 6 when the other children first called her empty, 8 when the elders confirmed it, 12 when her mother stopped making excuses to the pack council. She had no wolf, no inner fire, no shift, no howl, no scent mark that declared her something to be reckoned with. What she had was her grandmother's saying, and a pressed clover blossom tucked inside a cracked locket around her neck, given to her the morning the old woman died. "You feel what others cannot name," her grandmother had whispered. "That is not nothing. That is everything." Maren was 23 now, and she carried both, the saying and the locket, into the grandest, most terrifying threshold she had ever crossed, the iron gate of Stonecroft Hall, seat of the Ashvin Alpha King. She had not been invited. Chapter 1. The wrong door. She had meant to deliver the ledgers to the steward's entrance. That was the whole of the errand. Carry the bound accounts from the village tax collector's office to the hall's receiving clerk. Collect a receipt. Return before dark. Simple enough for anyone who knew the path. Maren did not know the path. The lantern she'd borrowed had guttered in the valley wind, and the gravel fork she chose at the base of the east garden had led her through a gap in a yew hedge and a door she had genuinely believed was a tradesman's entry, directly into the ground-floor corridor of Stonecroft Hall itself. The carpets were the first sign she'd gone wrong. Red and gold, thick as moss, running the length of a hallway lit by oil sconces in silver brackets. The second sign was the portrait gallery, 7 feet tall, severe faces in gilded frames, each one bearing the unmistakable hawked profile of the Ashvin royal line. The third sign was the butler. He emerged from a side room like a shadow, deciding to have an opinion. Tall, thin, dressed in black so precise it looked architectural. His name was Aldrin. She would learn that later. In the moment she only saw his expression, which was the expression of a man who had opened his coat to find a pigeon roosting in the lining. "This," he said, "is not the steward's annex." "I know that now." He looked at the ledger clutched to her chest, at her wool coat with its mismatched buttons, at her boots still muddy from the valley path. His nostrils flared, reading her scent, she knew, cataloging her the way shifters cataloged everything. Wolfless. Low rank. No claim here. She had spent a lifetime watching that particular calculation happen behind people's eyes. "I'll go," she said, "if you'll just point me toward—" The corridor shifted. Not the walls, the air. A pressure change, like the moment before lightning, that Maren had always been able to feel even when others dismissed it as imagination. Every sconce flame bowed in unison. And the Alpha King walked in. Chapter 2. The King at the End of the Hall. He was not what stories made him. The stories said Calder Ashvin was remote, magnificent, carved from the same gray granite as his hall. They said his wolf was a black beast the size of a cart horse, and his word was the last word on every matter, between the Thornback Mountains and the coast. They said he had turned away 3 noble Omega matches in as many years without explanation, and that he ate breakfast alone every morning in a room with no windows, because he did not like to be watched while he thought. What Maren saw was a man in a riding coat that had been rained on, dark hair pushed back impatiently, jaw carrying a day's worth of shadow. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and his eyes, when they found her, were a light, startling gray that made her think of the sky right before a storm breaks and decides what kind of storm it means to be. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at Aldrin. "Who is this?" "A delivery woman, Your Grace. She came through the east garden door in error." Another second of those gray eyes on her face. Not cruel, she noted. Tired. Deeply, architecturally tired in the way of someone who had been performing a role so long, the performance and the person had begun to argue with each other. "Throw her out before breakfast," he said. Not please escort her, not kindly redirect her. Throw her out. Like weather. Like a draft. Aldrin turned to her with the professional sympathy of a man paid to be apologetic. "If you'll follow me." The ledger slipped. It fell because her hands were cold from the valley walk, and she had been gripping it too hard, and when she grabbed for it the cover splayed, and 3 seasons of tax records scattered across the red and gold carpet in a long paper fan. She dropped to her knees immediately, gathering, and one sheet slid under the edge of a side table and required her to reach entirely under it with both arms to retrieve, which meant she was on all fours in the corridor of the Alpha King's home, while he stood 12 feet away and watched. She did not rush. Rushing never helped. She gathered each page, squared the edges, stood. There was a single sheet she'd missed. At the toe of his boot, she realized. He was looking down at it. He picked it up. It was a supply record for the southern Ashvin villages. She'd been the one to transcribe it, working 3 evenings by candlelight because the old collector's handwriting was failing, and the numbers needed to be legible for the council audit. The columns were precise. The marginal corrections were color-coded with what she'd had available, 2 different shades of ink and 1 faded pencil. He read it. Actually read it, not a glance, but a genuine scan of the figures. "This is wrong," he said. She kept her voice level. "Which line?" He turned the page toward her. His finger rested below the 3rd column, the grain tithes from Ashvin's eastern hamlets. "That number is correct," she said. "The discrepancy you're seeing is because the prior year comparison uses the pre-drought calendar. These are adjusted figures. The notation is in the margin." His finger moved to the margin. He read the notation. "Aldrin," he said without looking away from the page. "Your Grace." "Hold breakfast." Chapter 3. The Room with No Windows. The study had no windows, exactly as the stories said. It had instead an entire wall of bookshelves, and a fireplace large enough to park a modest cart in, and a desk so old and scarred it looked like it had survived several sieges and 1 fire, and been the better for all of it. Marin sat in a chair across from it, because the Alpha King had gestured at the chair, and Aldrin had vanished, and she was holding the ledger in her lap and trying to determine whether she was in trouble. Calder Ashvin sat across from her and read the entire current year summary. All 12 pages. She knew the content by heart. She'd transcribed the whole thing, so she watched his face instead. He read the way serious readers read, forward, then backward when something required it, with a slight tension at his left brow when the numbers didn't match his expectations. "Who compiled this?" He set the pages down. "I transcribed it. Harwick Len is the collector of record." "I know who Harwick Len is. His handwriting looks like a drunk crow's footprints, and in 4 years I've had to send his reports back for corrections twice a cycle." He tapped the margin of the page with the color-coded notation. "This is yours." "Yes. You're wolfless." The directness of it would have stung from anyone else. From him it sounded merely like a man filing a fact, not assigning a value. "Yes. You're not on any of the pack rolls I've reviewed." "I live in Ashvin territory without formal pack membership. There are others like me." "I know there are." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition of a debt. "The support structures for unaffiliated Omegas in this territory are inadequate," she said, because he seemed to be searching for the word. "I was going to say underfunded, but your word is more honest." Silence. The fire settled. Outside, rain began. She had felt it coming since the valley, that pressure on her skin, and here it was. "What's your name?" "Marin Voss." He wrote it down on a piece of paper. Then he looked at what he'd written, as if it had said something to him he needed to consider. "Marin Voss," he said. "The Eastern Hamlet grain discrepancy. If you adjust the prior year figures to the post-drought calendar, what's the actual shortage?" She told him, from memory. He wrote that down too. Chapter 4. What Aldrin Observed. Aldrin had been butler to the Ashvin estate for 19 years, and he had learned early that the most important information was never found in what powerful people said, but in what they did in the 3 seconds before they realized anyone was watching. He brought breakfast to the study at 3 minutes past 9, later than usual, because he had sensed the situation required patience. He carried it himself, rather than delegating. 2 settings. He had assumed one, but something about the way the Alpha King's voice had changed when he called back down the corridor, "Hold breakfast," suggested that the morning had become, quietly, a different kind of morning. He set the tray on the side table. Eggs, bread, honey. The strong tea that His Grace required before human conversation was entirely possible, and without being asked he had added a second cup. Neither of them commented on the second cup. That was how Aldrin knew he'd read it correctly. The girl, Morin Voss, he had already filed the name, had the careful stillness of someone who had learned to take up no more space than was granted to her. But she was not diminished. There was a difference, he had found, between people who were small because they had been crushed and people who were compact because they were dense with something waiting. She was the second kind. The Alpha King was explaining the Eastern Road assessment, a 3-year infrastructure problem that had defeated 2 advisors, and the girl was listening in a way that most of his advisors did not waiting for her turn to speak, not constructing her response while he talked, but actually absorbing, integrating, and occasionally asking a question so clean it cut through 3 levels of deflection and went straight to the mechanism of the problem. At one point, she picked up her teacup and held it with both hands and said, "If the assessment is based on road use volume as currently measured, it will always undercount the wolfless and low-rank population. We don't travel on the main routes. We use the old paths." Calder Ashvin stopped speaking for a full 4 seconds. In 19 years, Aldrin had watched many people say many things to this man. He had rarely seen him stop for 4 seconds. "Because the main routes require pack tokens for the night checkpoints," the Alpha King said slowly, "which were established for security, and are perfectly reasonable," Marin said carefully, "but have the effect of rendering a segment of your territory's population functionally invisible to the assessment." Aldrin quietly refilled her cup and withdrew. Chapter 5. The Locket. The rain had been going for 2 hours when Marin realized she had been here far longer than any errand warranted. She should stand, make her apologies, leave the ledger with the correct person and return to the village before the path became difficult. She had work tomorrow. She always had work tomorrow. 3 different jobs that together paid for her room above the candlemaker's shop and left enough for flour, and, if the month was good, the occasional extravagance of proper ink rather than the watered-down substitute. She reached for the locket, as she always did when she needed steadying, a reflex so old she no longer thought about it, just found her fingers at her collarbone, closing around the small, warm brass oval. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Shifters noticed everything. "What is that?" "My grandmother's." He waited in that particular way that was not intrusive, but was entirely attentive. She found herself explaining, which she never did. The cottage, the porch, the barefoot mornings, the old woman with her sayings, and her garden knowledge, and her absolute refusal to treat Marin as an absence shaped like a girl. She said, Marin hesitated, she did not typically offer her grandmother's saying to strangers. It had lived in her chest for 15 years, like a coal, keeping warmth without needing to be shown. She said a wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin. He was very still. She meant that what I lack doesn't determine what I know. Marin released the locket. She was practical about it. She didn't believe in pretending wounds weren't wounds, but she also didn't believe in letting someone else's catalog of your deficiencies become your own. She sounds, Calder said, like someone who should have advised councils. She advised me. I think that was sufficient purpose for one person. He stood abruptly and went to the bookshelf. She watched him search, not the performed searching of a man who wanted to look thoughtful, but actual searching, a little frustrated, 3rd shelf from the bottom, 4th book from the left. He pulled a volume out. It was thin, a pamphlet really, and the cover was water-stained. He held it out. "This was submitted to my council 8 months ago," he said. a proposal for a secondary assessment system for unaffiliated territory residents. It was rejected as administratively complex. I've been looking for a reason to revisit it that my council cannot dismiss. What you told me about the old paths. He stopped. She looked at the pamphlet, then at him. You want me to annotate it? I want you to tear it apart and tell me what it gets wrong, and what it gets right, and whether it can be salvaged, or whether we need to begin from scratch. I'm a transcription clerk. You are, he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing truth over convenience. Considerably more than that. I've spent 3 hours this morning theming that out, and I'm irritated that it took an accidental delivery to accomplish it. Chapter 6. The Thing About Rain. She stayed for the annotating. She told herself it was only through the morning. Then the rain made the valley path inadvisable, and she stayed for midday. Then the midday led to the road assessment model, which led to a comparative population survey she found on the third shelf she was permitted to access, which led to a conversation about the night checkpoint system that became, without her quite tracking the trajectory, the most substantive exchange she had ever had with any person about anything. He argued. She had not expected that. Had expected a great man who would listen to be agreed with, which was the usual shape of power. Instead, he pushed back on her checkpoint analysis, citing 3 specific incidents, and she pushed back on his citation, pointing out that all 3 incidents involved the main road, not the old paths, which rather supported her original point. You're not deferential, he observed somewhere in the 4th hour. I'm not, she agreed. Is that a problem? Every advisor I have is deferential. It's like being surrounded by mirrors that only reflect the angle you'd prefer. That sounds lonely. She said it simply, without calculation, and then heard how it sounded and looked at the fire instead of at him. The fire was safer. The fire didn't have those gray eyes that had spent the last 4 hours moving between the survey pages and her face and back to the pages in a rhythm she had tried very hard not to notice or assign meaning to. Marin? He said her name the way people said words they were deciding whether to keep. She looked at him. Why did you accept the ledger delivery? If you have 3 jobs, the rate for a delivery errand is poor use of your time. She thought about lying. Something diplomatic about civic responsibility, the importance of accurate accounts. Harwick Len's hands shake badly in cold weather. He asked. I didn't want him to walk the valley path in the dark. You did it for him? He's 71, and he taught me double-entry accounting by firelight over 3 winters, because I asked him to, and he liked having someone who wanted to know. She shrugged. It seemed fair. Calder stood again as he did when something moved through him that he hadn't anticipated. He went to the window. There were no windows in this room, so he went to the doorway instead, looking into the corridor, and she could see his shoulders, wide and rain-damp under the riding coat he still hadn't changed. Aldrin. The butler appeared. Always within range, never intrusive. Remarkable. Has the valley path cleared? Aldrin checked. There was a pantomime of checking that took 40 seconds, and which Marin suspected was mostly theater. Still very poor, Your Grace. The lower crossing floods by afternoon when there's been sustained rain. Miss Voss will need a room for the night. Of course. Aldrin looked at her. The faintest warmth in his professional reserve, something that might, in other light, be approval. I'll prepare the East Wing guest room. The East Wing is cold, Calder said. The room above the study has its own fire. Aldrin's expression did not change at all, which meant he was working very hard to prevent it from changing into something inappropriate. Of course, Your Grace. Chapter 7. Before breakfast, she should have slept. The room above the study was warm, the bed was the softest thing that had ever happened to her, and the fire had been laid by someone who understood how to build a fire that would last the whole night without attention. She lay in the dark and turned the pamphlet over in her hands. She'd borrowed it from the study. He'd told her to take whatever she needed, and she'd been making notes in the margins by candlelight for an hour, ideas proliferating the way they always did when she finally had material worthy of them, her pen moving fast. The saying came to her again. A wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin. She had always understood it as a comfort, a reassurance that absence wasn't absence, that what she couldn't do didn't hollow out what she could. But lying here, in this warm room, in this impossible house, with a man 1 floor below who had looked at her work and said considerably more than that, she understood it differently. Her grandmother hadn't been describing a consolation. She'd been describing a gift. She pressed her fingers to the locket. The study door, 1 floor below, opened and closed. Footsteps, not the measured architectural tread of Aldrin, but a different cadence, restless. He was awake too. She didn't think. She took the annotated pamphlet and the candle and went downstairs. He was at the desk. He had changed out of the riding coat at last and was in a plain white shirt, collar open, looking at nothing with the focused expression of a man trying to outthink a problem he couldn't define. She set the pamphlet on the desk between them. He looked at it, the margins thick with her notes, arrows connecting sections, 3 flagged passages with her assessment of which could be rebuilt and which should be abandoned. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could I." He pulled the pamphlet toward him and began to read. She sat down. The fire was low but adequate. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the valley would clear by morning. She thought, "By morning, I'll have to go." The thought was a small stone dropped into still water, and she watched the rings spread. He looked up from the pamphlet. "Maren?" That decision word again, her name in his mouth. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because I have, as you noted, been surrounded by mirrors for long enough that I've lost my calibration for honest answers. All right. Today, this conversation, was it—" He looked for the word. He was careful with words she'd noticed. Precise. "Was it merely interesting to you, or was it—" "It was the best day I've had in years," she said, "and I'm aware that tells you more about my years than it tells you about the day. But there it is." He was quiet for a moment that lasted several different kinds of time. "I told Aldrin to throw you out before breakfast," he said. "I know. I was there." "I would like to—" He stopped. Started again. Something that might have been, on a less controlled face, nervousness. "I would like to ask you to stay past breakfast. For the assessment work." "For the assessment work," he agreed. "And—" He did not finish the sentence. He looked at her instead, those gray, storm-deciding eyes, and she felt it. The thing her grandmother had meant. The thing beyond the catalog of what she lacked. The thing that was purely and entirely hers. She felt the weight of being seen, fully, without accommodation or reduction, by someone who had no political reason to see her. "And," she said softly. The fire settled. The valley outside was clearing. Dawn was still an hour away. Chapter 8. By breakfast, Aldrin served breakfast at 7. He brought it to the study, as he had brought the previous day's breakfast to the study, because the Alpha King had not gone to the breakfast room in 14 months, and Aldrin had stopped pretending he would. He set the tray on the side table, eggs, bread, honey, strong tea, and added a second cup and a second setting without hesitation, because this morning there was no ambiguity about the second cup. The girl was sitting across the desk with ink on her right hand and the annotated pamphlet between them and the expression of someone who had been awake for some portion of the night, thinking hard about things that mattered. The Alpha King had the expression of a man who had decided something in the night and had been waiting since roughly 4 in the morning for the world to catch up. "Aldrin," Calder said, "Your Grace, I have a logistical question for you. I live to answer them. If someone were to join the household on a permanent basis, in an advisory capacity, what would be the appropriate formal procedure?" Maren's pen stopped moving. Aldrin considered the question with immense professional gravity. "That would depend on the nature of the advisory role, sir. If the position were purely professional, a council appointment would suffice. If the nature were, more broadly domestic, tradition holds that a formal offer would precede any council notification." Maren looked at Calder. Calder looked at Maren. He reached into the desk drawer and set something on the desk between them. It was small and old, and she didn't immediately understand what she was seeing. A ring, she realized, worn and plain, the metal warm yellow gold in the lamplight. The kind of ring that had been on a hand for so many years it no longer remembered any other shape. "My grandmother's," he said. "She left it with instructions that it was for the woman who could argue with me." A pause. "I am told there has historically been a shortage." The sound Marin made was not quite a laugh, and not quite a breath. "You can't propose to someone you met yesterday." "I can. Whether I should is a separate question. Whether you would consider it is the question I'm asking." "I'm wolfless." She said it not with shame, but with the directness of someone who had learned to name the things that others used against her before they could. "I know. I have no pack, no rank, no political alliance. I know. I live above a candlemaker's shop and I own 4 books, and one of them is falling apart. Marin." His voice was very quiet. "I know. I know all of it. I have spent one day learning who you are, and in that one day, I have understood more about what I need, what this territory needs, than I have in 4 years of advisors who smell like political calculations." He looked at the ring on the desk. "I'm not asking you to accept. I'm asking you to consider." She picked up the ring, held it in her palm. It was warm from the drawer and heavier than it looked. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it cannot be because the valley flooded and I had nowhere to go, and you were kind, and the room above the study was warm. It has to be because what?" She looked at him. She pressed her fingers to her collarbone, to the locket there, and her grandmother's voice came to her for the last time that morning. "A wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin." "Because I felt you," she said. "Before I saw you. That pressure in the hallway. That's how I've always experienced things that matter. My grandmother called it feeling the rain." She opened her hand, looked at the ring. "I felt it when you walked in." He said nothing. The fire said nothing. Outside, finally, the sun was beginning. "I'll consider it," Marin said. She closed her hand around the ring. "I would like to keep this while I consider." "How long will you need?" She set her pen down, picked up her teacup, looked at him over the rim. "I'll let you know before breakfast is cold." The eggs were still warm when she said yes. Epilogue. 1 year later, the saying was on the wall above the study fireplace now. Marin had painted it herself. In the good ink, not watered down, never watered down anymore, though she still kept a bottle of the thin pale variety in her desk, as a reminder of which direction she'd come from. The letters were her grandmother's handwriting, reproduced from memory, arching over the carved mantelpiece like a benediction. "A wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin." The study had a window now. She had lobbied for it in the 2nd month, citing the impact of natural light on sustained cognitive work, and Calder had agreed with the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to tell him the room was too dark. The window looked east, over the valley, and in the mornings when the weather was building she could see the pressure of it coming, the specific golden thickening of the air above the Thornback Mountains, and she would feel it on her skin long before anyone else smelled it. She had been formally received by the Territory Council at the autumn session, 6 weeks after the morning of the eggs in the ring. The reception had been mixed. 2 of the 7 council members had been vocally opposed. 1 had used the word wolfless, the way people used it when they wanted it to land like a stone. Calder had looked at that man with the gray storm eyes and said, with a quiet that was worse than shouting, "Advisor Voss has in the past 3 weeks identified an 80-year error in our population assessment methodology, proposed a new secondary support framework for unaffiliated residents that the Junior Council has already approved in principle, and corrected a boundary record that would have cost the territory a substantial legal dispute. I suggest you revise your vocabulary before our next session." The man had revised his vocabulary. The secondary support framework had passed in full in the spring. The old paths were now officially mapped and acknowledged in the assessment model. 23 wolfless residents who had been functionally invisible to the territory's records now had formal support access. Harwick Len had cried when she told him, which had made her cry, which had made Calder pretend to be very busy with a piece of correspondence on the other side of the room. She was at the desk now, working through a land tenure review, the morning light coming in long and gold through the new window, when she heard his step in the corridor. She always heard it, knew its rhythm as well as her own heartbeat now. He came in, set a cup of tea at her elbow, and stood behind her looking at what she was reading, one hand on the back of her chair. She reached up and touched his hand. He turned it over and held hers. "Valley's fogging up," she said. "Rain before noon. After, I'd say 3 o'clock. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of her head with the ease of someone exercising a right he'd grown accustomed to and was still faintly surprised by. "You're always right about the rain." "I feel it." She touched the locket at her collarbone, still there, always there, warm brass and a pressed clover blossom inside that was now 16 years old and still held its shape. "Grandmother's fault." On the wall above the fire, the words curved in her grandmother's remembered hand. She had been thinking about them differently lately, thinking about how the saying had always seemed to be about compensation, about what you could do without a wolf, without a shift, without the things that marked you as valuable in the old currency, and how, somewhere in the past year, it had shifted meaning on her. It wasn't about compensation anymore. It was about a different kind of knowing. A knowing that didn't announce itself, didn't display, didn't require anyone's catalog to confirm it. The kind that lived in the skin, in the pressure sense, in the recognition of rain before rain arrived. The kind that had walked her through a yew hedge and a wrong door, and directly, improbably, precisely, into the life she'd been built for. She turned the locket over in her fingers, feeling the small, familiar weight of it, the worn hinge, the slight asymmetry where it had been dropped once on a stone floor long ago. Her grandmother's hands had held it. Now hers did. A wolf that cannot smell the rain still feels it on her skin. Not consolation. Navigation. She had always known where she was going. She had simply needed the rain to confirm the direction. Outside, over the Thornback Mountains, the air thickened and turned gold. She picked up her pen and smiled. End.